for the smiles. At least that should ease my nervousness. And I think I'm already setting the tone for how this night is going to be. But I have to be on my best behavior because I know we have a lot of people also joining online. And I just want to start by saying a very warm welcome to everyone in the room here in the Royal Society of Edinburgh and to all the viewers online on YouTube. This evening promises to be a very, very engaging session and a very lively session, I would expect as well. You're all familiar with the topic, you know why we're here. Well, that was the wrong time for that not to show. But then the topic has been advertised. I'm not going to bore you repeating all that, but I'll give you a very brief introduction about myself. I'm Omalabake Fakunle. Everybody calls me Labake. I am a senior lecturer, Chancellor's Fellow at the University of Edinburgh. I'm based at the Murray House, and I have the joy of being the co-lead of the Race Review Response Group for the university. You don't have to say it, you've all read the news. Yes, the Guardian were not shy about publishing the race review from the University of Edinburgh, and we're looking into that. So it gives me great pleasure, actually, to be invited to chair this particular event that that we're going to be talking a lot of Ash's work, and then we're going to be taking Q&A at the end of the session. And like I said, I'm not going to read again, the event details about how this is so important to look at the work. Maybe we could call it provenance work, but definitely a piece of research that's been ongoing, and to talk about what has happened, what is happening, and hopefully to look into the future on what we can do to talk more about this, this topic. But of course, we cannot do that without doing a little bit of housekeeping first, which I have to read so that I don't give you the wrong exit routes. The fire exit routes are on the current slide. But please follow courier staff instructions in the case of an evacuation not planned. We are not expecting an alarm, but courier staff will be on hand to help and guide you if there is a fire alarm, and if it does go off. Could you wave your hands, couriers? Yes. So they would lead us in the case of an evacuation, but it is not planned. So I would also share briefly the bios of our speaker, Ash, and also introduce you to Malcolm as well. Ash Shelton is no longer a PhD student because she submitted her thesis a few weeks ago, and now she's waiting to do her Viva, so congratulations on the submission, and at the University of Edinburgh. And she does work on museums, heritage collection. She has a lot of experience. I would leave Ash to talk a bit more about herself because she might want to share more about what led her into this research and why she is doing this. And later on, for the Q&A, we're going to have Malcolm McCallum, who is looking very, very eager to go. And he is the Anatomical Museum Curator for the University of Edinburgh. Malcolm is a researcher as well at the university's Anatomical Museum and has worked in the heritage sector since 1996. He manages the curatorial team at the museum and the ongoing inventory project, carrying out research on the collections and curating the displays in the museum, working with colleagues in anatomy as well as in the heritage collections. Malcolm has been leading on recent repatriations of human remains from the Anatomical Museum. So after Ash delivers our talk, which will last for around 30, 40 minutes, then I will invite Malcolm to join us on the stage to take on your questions. So I think the last bit I need to do here is to say that you're in for a very fantastic event. I have to read it as it's been told me, but I believe it. And you would have the chance to ask questions of our speakers. But we won't be taking any questions while Ash is speaking. So I would ask you to keep your questions, write them down and indicate. And for the people online, we would have the Curious team who will take the questions. So if I see your hand up, I will call you, and we'll try to have a mix of people online and people in the room as well. And I think without further ado, I would invite Ash to give her talk. Thank you, Ash.
I'd just like to say thank you for the introduction. Just to add a couple of extra things about myself. I am qualified as an archivist, so I've got a background in information management and preservation. I recently completed my PhD. Well, not quite completed, I've submitted it, I'm awaiting the viva. And my topic was looking at legacies of race and slavery in the early Encyclopedia Britannica using text mining approaches. So essentially looking at very, very large volumes of data and see how we can approach these. So that's kind of my background, and that's what led me into this research position. As you can see here, I just want to give a content warning, as I'll be discussing some sensitive topics. So human remains, death, violence and bodily harm are all going to be topics that will be mentioned. And there are also some references to historic words, phrases and language that are considered harmful. So it's just to give everyone warning that will be involved in the talk, which I think everyone could probably have expected from the topic. So this talk has emerged from a part-time research project, research and cataloguing project with the Anatomical Museum, which I undertook earlier this year. I'll only be speaking to a very small portion of the research, so it's just to let you all know that what I'm presenting on this evening, there is a lot more behind this, and I'm happy to take further questions. And also, this talk and my research are not affiliated with the University Race Review that was published earlier this year, although it's obviously very timely research to come out at the same time. And the findings and any of my views that are expressed do not represent the university or the Anatomical Museum. Clicker would be helpful. So, the catalogue in Microsoft Excel that I was given to work with at the start of the project contained the names of donors to the collection, places associated with skulls and dates that they were given to the university, as well as acquisition notes. The catalogue was made up of a combination of information that was transferred from historic catalogues, so things that had been written hundreds of years ago, essentially copied out, so we had records of the original information that was recorded. This meant it was outdated and mostly used details from the earlier 19th and 20th century records. As a result, the information that was communicated was inconsistently written and often reflects the very limited information that contributes to obscuring the colonial associations and legacies that the collection has. So this documentation also often describes how skulls were presented, collected, or found by people in the collections, but this really glosses over the fact that many of these ancestral remains were stolen, coercively taken without consent from African communities who were often exploited and subject to colonial control. So with this slide, I just want to give an acknowledgement of this. Generally, I will be referring to items that have been acquired by the museum. This is sort of acknowledged with quotation marks. This is the language that's been used historically, and where possible, I will try and highlight the circumstances that individual skulls were actually removed from Africa. So some of the terms listed on the screen, which are from the Chew Inclusive Terminology Glossary, acquired, attained, discovered, found, obtained, gifted, appear later in this talk in various forms and have served to hide harmful collections' legacies. So that brings us on to the Anatomical Museum. So the Anatomical Museum, as currently is, was opened in 1884 under Sir William Turner, and this followed the building of the dedicated medical school in 1880. While this was when the museum as is opened, the collection started much earlier with the dynasty of Monroe professors of anatomy in the late 18th century, and this continued to grow. A collection was donated by Professor Alexander Monroe Secundus, who gave his collection and the collection of his father to the department, which included the African skull collections. Although there was a well-established anatomical collection for teaching prior to 1884, after the museum opened, it continued to expand its collection with human and animal bones, as well as casts, masks, drawings, books, and other objects. So 300 years of collecting has led to the ownership of overall around 12,000 items of all different types in the Anatomical Museum today. The current Anatomical Museum has been used as a site of teaching and learning since it opened in 1884, and these photos just give you a little sense of what it's looked like over time. When it first opened, it spanned across 3 floors. Before this was reduced to 1 floor in the 1950s, which you can see a little portion of in the middle image. And the museum currently supports student teaching, and it's only open to the public via appointment on certain days. Although the museum's collections are large, my research has focused specifically on the skulls brought from Africa to Edinburgh. Part of the collection came from the Edinburgh Phrenological Society. For anyone that isn't aware, phrenology was the study of the size and shape of the human skull, with the belief that the size and shape corresponded to specific characteristics, mental capacities, and traits of an individual. So this was linked inherently with racialized science, pseudoscience, it was later acknowledged to be. Phrenology had a large base in Edinburgh in the early 19th century, and eventually the specimens from the society were incorporated into the Anatomical Museum's collections. However, this collection is filled with gaps in our historical record. There's lots of missing information, and the historic records that play down the colonial influences on the collections are very evident in this research. The skulls are currently housed in a dedicated skull room and are not on display in the museum at present. So again, I'd like to acknowledge that there are many, many stories to be told through these collections, and that unfortunately there is a lot of information on the ancestral remains that does remain hidden. And I can't explore all of this today. I've only got 30 to 40 minutes, and there is so much more that could be said, but I'll try and give you a sense of the collection. So for the information that we do have, this particular collection includes 185 skulls from individuals descended from and collected in Africa. There are 78 different individuals or organisations named as donors to the collection, and there are 4, with an asterisk, which I'll explain in a second, names associated with the skulls that are in the collection. Unfortunately, in many cases, we don't know the names of a lot of the individuals in the collection, and this information is likely not going to be recovered, unfortunately. 2 of the skulls that do have names attached to them were donated by a Captain Felix via the Reverend Edward Craig, and were speculated to be the skulls of Ramses II and his wife, though this was widely disputed at the time, and they're now considered to have been falsely attributed to these individuals, hence the asterisk here. We have more information on an individual named Matrush, who died in South Africa. And finally, there is also a record that indicates that the museum has possession of the skull of Chief Mwenda Masiri, although there are some uncertainties around this individual, and I'll go into that with some of these case studies. So in this next section, I'm going to talk about Matrush, Chief Masiri, as well as the other unnamed individuals in the collection, and how the information is presented in the catalogue and how this feeds into how we can approach this type of research. So I really wanted to highlight the language used in these catalogues and why it's important to both have this recorded as it was historically presented, but also acknowledge why we need to look at these histories, readdress the collections, and make sure that these really problematic colonial legacies are being communicated properly and documented with respect. Excuse me. So one of the only specifically named individuals in the collection is Matrush, an 18-year-old Sandman. He reportedly died in South Africa, and his skull was presented to a Mr. Justice Burton by Major Rogers. Rogers was described as a guardian of slaves. We only have this level of information about Matrush because an 1830s Phrenological Journal article outlines a quote-unquote confession that Matrush supposedly gave before he died. This is called the Dying Confession of Matrush the Bosherman. In this, he supposedly went marauding and murdering through the country, and for a long time he escaped punishment. At length, Matrush was mortally wounded and died. Matrush is reported to have left his masters at a cattle farm before his quote-unquote marauding, and attempted to protect himself from his attackers. The Phrenological Journal also provided an assessment of Matrush's skull, from which they inferred his character to be quote-unquote savage and almost entirely animal. The confession was used to support the inference about his character, thus contributing to this racialized science that phrenology presented in the 19th century. The account was recorded by Major Rogers in the 1820s, but clearly conveys a very racialized perspective of Matrush as inferior, which was used as the justification for the violence that he was faced with. This story is very evidently one-sided and came at a time where colonial violence against African communities was very common. Matrush's story, as apparently conveyed by Major Rogers, formed a really interesting case study for the Phrenological Journal, which is the only reason that we have this level of information, albeit it's from a very skewed perspective, and any interpretations of confessions or documented accounts from the 19th, 20th centuries need to take this viewpoint into account. So another individual that we have more information on is Chief Mwenda Musiri of the UK Kingdom in Central Africa, correlating with the modern-day Democratic Republic of Congo. Chief was killed during the Stairs expedition to Katanga. The expedition was led by William Stairs and was a battle between the British South Africa Company and the Congo Free State for the mineral-rich territory of Katanga. Musiri was killed in 1891, and accounts of his death vary slightly. But his death is mostly presented as a defeat in the face of the triumphant white colonial powers. Daisy Chamberlain has recently completed some work that outlines the circumstances of Musiri's death and some context around the Anatomical Museum, which I've linked in a source slide at the end, which you'll be able to go back to and look at afterwards on YouTube. But it's just to flag up that other work has been done on this topic as well. There are some question marks over the assertion that this is in fact Musiri's skull due to discrepancies in the historical record, and further research is needed. This does highlight the fact that a lot of these accounts that are given of skulls, ancestral remains in the collection, there is certain amounts of evidence that is recorded, but there is a lot that goes unsaid. So a lot more work needs to be done in a lot of cases to uncover more information about the individuals and come to definitive conclusions. One of the things that stood out about the chief's records, though, is that his skull was catalogued under the pathology collections rather than anthropology and anatomy. Thus, his skull was not listed with the catalogue I was initially given that focused on the anatomy collections. This is seemingly because his skull is documented to have had a condition called, I've practiced saying this so many times and I'm still going to trip over it, so please excuse me, scaphocephaly. This is a condition at birth that causes the individual to have an elongated skull, so this was considered a skull of interest in the collections. The documentation of this skull with pathology rather than anatomy suggests that the skull was specifically of interest for teaching about the condition itself, and this was documented separately from the other skulls sourced from Africa in the collections. This serves as a reminder that a lot of the items that came into the collection were dehumanized. The condition was considered rather than the experience of the individual person, and a lot of the identity that was wrapped up with the person's ancestral remains. Excuse me. This kind of making connections across different records, different catalogues, adds layers of complexity in this kind of research for interpreting and understanding the collections, alongside the questions of this skull in particular's origins. Leading on with the topic of dehumanization, a lot of the individuals whose skulls are held in the museum do not have recorded names attached to them, so their identities are somewhat, if entirely, anonymous. Many of the individuals are identified through the people that donated the skulls and by the catalogue reference numbers, a combination of Roman numerals and letters and numbers. These are museum standard historic identifiers, but inevitably dehumanise the individuals held in the collection by reducing them to numbered objects, which I think further serves as a distancing. Historically was used as a distancing method, and I think it's something that continues with collections today. I think in a lot of ways it was easier to dehumanise and reduce individuals to not consider the violence and oppression that many of them faced. In the case of the individuals identified here, so 2060, 1, 3, 5, and 7 to 10, these were given to the university by the Reverend Alexander Robb, who was a missionary with the Presbyterian Church. These skulls came from Old Calabar, which corresponds with present-day Nigeria. This was a major site of the slave trade and historically home to the Efik peoples. These remains came to the university in 1868 and are openly acknowledged as being taken from grave sites, meaning that they were stolen. An 1869 article in the Journal of Anatomy written by John Alexander Smith and Professor Turner, who oversaw the Anatomical Museum later, outlines the circumstances of the skulls being found. Quote, Dr. Robb informs us that the crania of the people of Old Calabar are difficult to obtain as the dead are carefully buried, and the exact site of their graves is usually kept secret. The skulls which he procured for us were picked up as opportunity offered from skeletons found lying in the forest. The fact that Smith and Turner deem it necessary to state how hard it was to acquire these remains of people, and the secrecy in guarding burial sites suggests that African communities were proactively trying to prevent graves being looted by European colonizers, and taking skulls as trophies and grave looting is heavily documented across the 19th period, especially. The report then goes on to state that the skulls found by Robb were those of slaves left in the woods to decay, and that they would otherwise have been eaten by animals. Assuming that this account was true, the individuals the skulls belonged to had already faced hardship and oppression as enslaved people, and whether they were murdered or died of illness or other causes is unclear. Again, this is unfortunately a circumstance that we might not be able to definitively say what happened to these individuals. The finding of the skulls is presented very positively here by Smith and Turner, and this acquisition predates the expansion of the Anatomical Museum, showing that Turner was developing the collections even before the new museum opened in 1884. So this article compares skulls given by Reverend Robb and concludes with a statement from the Reverend that the mental and physical degradation of the residents of Old Calabar was due to paganism, but Robb believed that they had the capability of being elevated to a higher platform of intelligence. This is the kind of opinion that was quite widely circulated and was used as missionaries to justify religious missions to convert people who were considered savages. A lot of this work took place in Africa in this period. So these three are just some small case studies that give a little bit more of an insight into some of the people in the collections, but also how they were documented in the collections and where the information came from. As you can see, the Phrenological Journal and the Journal of Anatomy give a very specific perspective, an assessment of the skulls and the perceived mental faculties of the individuals. But this leads on to some broader questions and something that I really want to dig into a little more detail with. How did the skulls come to Edinburgh? So religious missions, obviously one that I've listed here, and intervention from doctors and medical professionals. But all the skulls were brought through quite different routes, but we do start to see some patterns. This collection took place by explorers and naturalists, so human remains were not the object of a lot of the discoveries, but were picked up as collectors' items through different expeditions. One example is the Challenger expedition. Excuse me. Colonial administrators in Africa also gave items to the collection, and grave robbing and wars also contributed a lot of individuals to the collections. Perhaps most surprisingly, though, was the presence of medical students as people that donated to the collections. This hasn't been investigated at great length, but it's something that was a recurring theme in this research and that I really wanted to pick up on as an example of really proactive colonial collecting. So Turner's new anatomical museum clearly created more of a desire to increase the number of objects in the museum. The Edinburgh University calendar served as an advertisement of facilities of the university alongside other essential information for students, including, in the early days, exam papers, list of graduates, key staff members to contact. This information that I've got on the slide here is information on the Anatomical Museum that was given in the 1884 to 85 university calendar in the section about the Anatomical Museum. This reads, "The Conservator will be glad to receive contributions of rare and interesting specimens from graduates and former students of the university. He is especially desirous of making the collection thoroughly representative of the osteology, skeletons, of the different races of men and requests the gift of skulls and other bones of the skeleton from present and former pupils." This shows that students and former students were directly being petitioned and targeted and asked to expand the collection, particularly the skull collections. This was therefore very indicative of proactive colonial collecting led by university staff that was continued by students, and this is something that we actually see happening before the Anatomical Museum was opened in 1884 and that continues afterwards. If we recall Reverend Robb's earlier acknowledgement that communities were protective of their grave sites, meaning skulls and bones were difficult to acquire that would be of interest from different communities, Turner was clearly trying to appeal to any opportunity to increase the museum's skull collection through student networks. So, how did I track down the students that contributed to the collections? Some were listed as medical students, thus making the connection clear. For example, the top two names, Watson and Fourier, at the top of the screen there, they had med student listed next to their names. This was a very clear indication. Watson, I identified as Charles Henry James Watson, who donated items to the collection in 1897. He graduated in 1899 with a Bachelor of Medicine. Watson was from South Africa, and the skull that he presented was found in South Africa, described to be found on the banks of the Orange River in a native burying place. Again, we're seeing connections of individuals with South Africa that were then essentially stealing bodies, skeletons from grave sites. Fourier donated an item in 1898, but graduated in 1904, which I thought seemed like quite a jump in studies. And I actually found out that he graduated with a Bachelor of Medicine in 1904, but had an interruption of studies, during which, in 1899, he returned to South Africa to treat Boer War soldiers. The description of the individual that he donated is found with bones. Not an awful lot of extra information. Other individuals in the collection, I identified through looking at the titles that were used: Mr. William Fligg and J.C.H. Beaumont, Esquire. These indicated that the individuals didn't have an MD or a further title that would let them be referred to as doctor, and suggested that they might be students. This was the case with some of the names, but not all of them. For Mr. William Fligg, we don't have a date of when the donation was given, but we know it was under Sir William Turner. Fligg graduated in 1879 with a Bachelor of Medicine and Masters in Surgery, and the skull that he donated was found to be of a 15 to 17-year-old member of a tribe in Bulawayo, South Africa. Thus, we're not sure whether William Fligg donated the item to the museum, to the anatomical collections, while he was a student or afterwards. And this is something that has been difficult to figure out. With this information, it's not to say that further information might be uncovered down the line. This research project that I did was a short-term research project, so I'm hoping that at least by uncovering some information about the individuals held in the collection and the people who donated the skulls to the collection, this might create a further base for people doing more research in future. There are other individuals that I realised had been students and had since graduated. So Dr. Harvey Littlejohn donated a skull in 1901. Littlejohn was an academic, a forensic scientist and medical officer of health. He had associations with the University of Edinburgh later on and graduated in 1886. Excuse me. While I'm here, I will also mention that he was a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh and was made so in 1890 upon William Turner's suggestion. So this created quite a patchworked picture with some information that was forthcoming, but still some limited information. I'll just focus on one of these medical students in a little bit more detail, listed in the catalogue as BHS Aylward, who was recorded to have given 6 skulls to the museum in 1896. These correspond to items 26A 1-6 in the catalogue and were described to be in good condition and from Sharkona, East Bank of Nile. This seems to be a mistranscribed or alternate spelling of Sharuna, a historic site down the Nile south of Cairo. Assuming that Aylward acquired these skulls, we're not sure how exactly he acquired these skulls, close to the time he donated them. This coincides with a period of conflict between Britain and Egypt. Following the 1882 Anglo-Egyptian War, Britain occupied Egypt into the 20th century, and there were further conflicts through this period. Whether or not Aylward was somehow involved in any of these conflicts is unclear. However, it does raise a lot of questions about how students were somehow acquiring this number of skulls that were then being donated to the collections. So examining the graduations list in the Edinburgh University calendar again, I found BHS Aylward corresponded to Bernard Hugh Stanley Aylward, an English student who graduated from Edinburgh in 1900 with a Bachelor of Medicine degree. This timeline suggests that Aylward gave these skulls to the university while still a student, early in his studies, and the exact nature of how he came to have these in his possession remains unfortunately unclear and may remain so. This picture here lists Aylward as a student in dissecting classes in May 1897, a year after he reportedly gifted the skulls. Aylward is one of the many students I found to have given African skulls to the university, along with the others listed earlier, and some others. And this prompts further questions as to how many items in the collections were given by students across the entirety of the Anatomical Museum collections. Although this can't be answered definitively at present, it offers another insight into the proactive colonial collecting endorsed by the university in the 19th century, and it demonstrates a sustained pattern of colonial collecting and student contributions. So this next section, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the challenges a bit more explicitly in some of this provenance work. And during this talk, I've only been able to discuss a few of the individuals held in the collections in a bit more detail. There is so much more to be said about these collections and the colonial legacies that can't be ignored here, but I do want to give some space to the challenges for this type of provenance research or finding out the origins of collections. This type of research is evidently traumatic on multiple levels. Sharing this information with affected communities can cause distress and trauma, and researchers can experience secondhand trauma while conducting research themselves. This means that projects like this need to be approached with care and consideration to minimise distress to everyone involved, while still taking an appropriate level of accountability for these legacies and the historic trauma that has been caused. On a practical research level, missing records or incomplete documentation, as I've mentioned multiple times already, is of course an obvious challenge. Many of the catalogue entries have no dates or locations for where the skulls were found, which makes identifying the communities they're connected with very difficult, if not nigh on impossible. There is quite a long list of individuals who were donated in the Monroe collections that simply have no attached information and that I wasn't able to find any further information on. So the information that we have about those individuals now is still extremely limited. In many cases, more information can be found about the donors for the collections, but even some of these are limited in some cases. For example, if you have a record that was recorded as Mr. Smith donated an item. Mr. Smith is quite tricky to track down without further information, and this led to lots of cases of potentially being able to identify people but not being able to make a definitive connection. So even though the donor to the collections can provide more insights, sometimes this also creates a bit of a block in the research. On a more general note, there are also practical issues of funding, labour and time to dedicate to appropriate levels of care and attention for these types of research projects. These are important to make sure that these types of projects are carried out with appropriate levels of respect and detail. But I think often this is something that goes under the radar with these types of research, and these are sort of wider sector issues in the heritage sector, so galleries, libraries, archives and museums, which is why often these types of projects are project positions, short-term contracts, that sometimes can be research will be carried out and then can sometimes be dropped. So there are lots of issues in the wider sector that also need to be considered, not just specifically in looking at the collections here. This also feeds into the fact that organisations may not always be able to or willing to prioritise this type of work, either for the reasons here or because they don't wish to engage with this type of work that addresses and challenges colonial legacies. So I'm reaching the end here. What does all of this mean? The research that I've done in the African Skull Collection, held by the University of Edinburgh's Anatomical Museum, is only a very, very small point of progress. And it should be used as a either starting point or continuing point for further work and action, which should be prioritised moving forwards. This research has improved our understanding of collections and colonial legacies. The cataloguing work has helped to standardise information, make sure that information is presented clearly, presented in a way that can be looked at, but maintains the original acquisition notes, which means that we are still able to see how items were collected and documented historically, which is also very important. Where these kinds of records are removed entirely, this creates further gaps in records, and it can be then difficult to find and establish exactly how collections were viewed at the time that they were created. Of course, a lot of the information here has been lost to time through lack of documentation and the erasure of information, which was sometimes purposeful. So there are always going to be gaps and inconsistencies, unfortunately, with this kind of research. Where we do have more information, including about the people who brought the skulls to the university, we can begin to understand and address these historic colonial legacies that have shaped the university collections into what they are today. This work is also contributing to some larger national projects to understand the extent of the ancestral remains that are held by Scottish institutions and enable us as a whole to better understand how these collections should be treated and what actions should be taken by institutions. However, more work needs to be done by heritage institutions generally to understand and appropriately address the harmful colonial legacies that are present in these recorded histories. And this leads on to the potential to repatriate these ancestral remains. That is, to return them to the communities that they belong to. This is not something that I have discussed at length in this talk, partly because this research hopefully has the potential to prompt more conversations around repatriation of these collections. And so far, there has been no documented repatriation of African remains from the Anatomical Museum. So, while this project has gone some way to better understand these collections, there is still a very long way to go in this kind of research, both with the Anatomical Museum and further afield. The catalogues are not publicly available and thus create a barrier between the records themselves and the outside world. Easier access to important information about ancestral remains will offer a lot of transparency to the wider public and may help communities to identify ancestors that they wish to be repatriated. And this perspective that I have also aligns with some of the recommendations from the University Race Review as well. This research also signals the need for larger scale research across the skull collections and anatomical records as a whole at the University of Edinburgh that might identify more connections across the collections, such as the prevalence of student donors and other connections across the materials. There are increasing calls for repatriation of ancestral remains and objects that are making it to the news and public eye more. Everyone in this room, people at home, you will likely have seen more of these stories appearing in the news cycle. This is a really important discussion that needs to be had and not shied away from. As a society, we need to be discovering where can more provenance research be done to understand and properly document the ancestral remains held in our UK institutions, and how can we support repatriation? Repatriation is a process that requires careful consideration, supporting research, and is often assessed on a case-by-case basis, so is also quite time-consuming, so this needs to be factored into approaches that are taken. However, hopefully, more provenance research such as this is hopefully a step in the right direction for the Anatomical Museum. This is the sources list. It's quite limited, but here are some of the things I've drawn on through this talk. And I would also just like to close with a thanks to Malcolm McCallum, the Anatomical Museum curator, for helping support this research, David Price and Rachel Hosker, both from the University of Edinburgh, all the staff in the Centre for Research Collections for their help moving many, many boxes of records, and the Royal Society of Edinburgh Curious team for helping put together this wonderful event. Thank you. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Okay, so you've had it all, or some.
Some.
Yes. And this is now time for Q&A. Malcolm, would you like to first just briefly introduce yourself again?
Sure. So I'm Malcolm. I'm the curator of the Anatomical Museum. Quite oftenly, we are confused with Surgeons' Hall Museum, but we're not. We're part of the anatomy department at the medical school at the university. My role has been to oversee a lot of the repatriation work that's been done recently to Japan, to Canada, to Taiwan, Sri Lanka, various other places. A lot of the repatriation work is done, all of it is done confidentially, so we don't shout about what we're doing. But what we've also not been very good at, and historically, is telling people what we've done and the processes and policies that we work under at the university. So our first repatriation was actually in 1947, so it was one very early, back to Ceylon, as it was at the time, Sri Lanka. The day-to-day role of the museum is a study space for medical students. So if you do an anatomy module, you can come and study there. We're also mindful of the fact that in the same building, if you want to donate your body and use your body for anatomical research and teaching, that also happens in the building. So we call these individuals the silent teachers. We're increasingly known as that. Our aim, our standard is to try to create an environment where we treat the historical human remains that have come into the building unethically, largely, with the same dignity and respect as we treat the modern donors today. That's the challenge.
Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing that bit of information. So now, if you want to ask your questions, raise your hand and you would get one of the roving mics. And please wait to get the mic before you speak so that everyone in the room can hear you. And for those watching online, if you have a question, type it in the chat, and then one of our Curious staff will also raise their hand, and I would call them to share the question with us. So, oh, wow. Okay.
Straight up.
Hello. I was very interested that the Anatomical Museum has already quite a lot of experience of repatriating human remains. And I wondered how the more recent requests have come about and whether you've had any requests from Africa for the skulls that were being discussed this evening.
Just to interrupt, I am not answering the question. But if you choose, you may wish to introduce yourself and your organization as well, if you would like to, okay? No pressure.
The African skulls, we have had quite a few conversations with various individuals and some governments as well. We're keeping that confidential. What we have done, apart from one example recently, is we are reactive there's only myself and one other colleague. So we kind of wait until there's a repatriation request that comes in to the university. That's it. Sorry, that was half an answer.
And I just wonder how you manage the fact that, I mean, how can you, if you've had say for example you've had a request from Africa, how do you deal with the fact that you have possession of something that can't be owned by anybody, surely?
Yeah, or insured, to
Yeah.
be honest, in terms of museums.
Yeah.
What we try to do is we work with, where we can, with government officials from that country. And it's a long period of negotiation and conversation. And the delay isn't usually the university side. It's usually people try to think what they want to do with their ancestors. Some people definitely don't want me to talk about this. Other people like to use it to promote a cause or to help their country's, identity, I suppose. Maybe an example more recently would be we repatriated to Taiwan. The British government does not recognise Taiwan as a country, so we were working with the Chinese government, and it was all getting very political, complicated. So we just don't know. We find every single repatriation is different, and the African repatriation, potential repatriations, will be no different than that. We just have to take on a case-by-case basis when it comes in.
Yes, please.
Thank you. Jamie Davis from the University of Edinburgh Anatomy section. So I think you gave a really excellent presentation, and one of the themes that ran through it was colonialism and the lack of respect shown to the people whose skulls are now in our collection. I just wondered, as somebody with a grasp of history, whether you'd see in that era a significant difference between the respect shown there and the respect shown to skulls from workhouses or from other British sources, or whether generally anatomical material was treated with very little respect wherever it came from. I'm not setting, I genuinely don't know the answer I'm asking.
So I can probably give a reasonably limited answer. The anatomical collections do include items that represent people that were considered to have mental illnesses that were of interest. So when I was doing this research, I was also seeing records for other individuals. I think generally it's a recurring pattern. I think there is perhaps more emphasis on the pseudoscience related to phrenology and the sort of justification for how people from different races, aside from what was perceived as the white superior race, how people were treated. I think that's very firmly cemented, but I think there is generally, as far as the research, the documentation that I've seen, there does seem to be an element of dehumanization to individuals that came from workhouses as well. And people were very much reduced to illnesses or conditions that were considered interesting. So I think there's definitely an element of that, but I think it's definitely explicitly seen with some of the collections from people around the world that are in the anatomical collections. But Malcolm might be able to speak a bit more to some of the other collections that are present.
I think the phrenology thing is quite interesting because the Edinburgh Phrenological Society was established in 1820, kind of went in decline. It was debunked, throughout the 19th century. But then in 1885, I think it was, there were still remnants of this collection, which then transferred to the anatomy department. So the anatomists weren't teaching phrenology in 1885, but they got these, well, you might have seen 350 or so life and death masks from the phrenology collection. If you go to the portrait gallery, there's about 20 on display on loan from us. But crucially, as part of this, there was also 400 human skulls that came from the phrenology department. So these weren't skulls to look at anthropology or anatomy. These were skulls to try to create this racial pseudoscience or racial hierarchy. These are the ones that cause the most problems for us. The Phrenological Journal was actually quite good for actually getting provenance, much more so that the anatomists weren't as good as writing up where the skulls were coming from than the phrenologists were. So ironically, they've served us better over time. So I think there's, you see that collection, the phrenology collection, is completely complicated items. I think in the 19th century, 1832 onwards, after the Anatomy Act, you're collecting people from all sorts of society because you could. Poorhouses, prisons, asylums. But you still see categorisation of people with microcephaly as idiot number 4 in the catalogue. So there's lots of challenges right through the centuries, I would say, as much as anything else.
Yeah. One thing I was just going to add to that also is that the Phrenological Society collections did happen to be some of the most well documented. The Phrenological Journal article that I mentioned, there is such an extensive list of the skull was passed from this person to this person to this person, who then reviewed it and they sent notes with along with the skull to this other person. So you have a sort of, because there's such heavy documentation, I think, and interest in where people came from, you do get a lot of detail in these collections that you don't necessarily see in some of the other collections. So it does add a level of detail in the descriptions that are present in the catalogue, but obviously there's still a lot of information missing, specifically often about the individual and sort of humanising elements of them as well.
Should we go online quickly, then come back to you? Yes.
Yes, we've actually got a very active online audience today. So I'll just start with one from Quenth, which is, how can we incentivise institutions to prioritise this kind of research?
Whew, that's the question, isn't it? I think that is the problem that I think people are trying to solve currently. I'll pass over to Malcolm in a second as well, but I'm just thinking about all of the claims that organisations would be decolonising collections in 2020 following George Floyd's murder and the BLM movement. That specifically sort of really, you saw a lot of statements coming out of universities and sort of short-term projects that sort of fell flat. And I think there wasn't enough momentum to keep things up. Often I think this does come back to the issues that I talked about in terms of funding, time, resources that don't just impact this kind of work, but the heritage sector is chronically underfunded and understaffed, and people are already working at capacity. And I think with what is perceived as additional projects that get added on, it can be quite a tricky terrain to navigate because it's work that needs doing. But I think often there's lots of barriers that come up. But I think we, as a sector, as you know, the UK public in general, we need to be working at ways that we can try and address this more thoroughly, more consistently, and keep up momentum with projects. Malcolm, you probably have a perspective as well.
Yeah, I mean, the challenge is the university sector financially is in a bit of chaos at the moment. The funding model is not appropriate for current needs. We really need like 10 Ashes to come and look at all the provenance of our collection. There's nearly 2,000 human skulls in the anatomy collection. Ashes looked at 185 over a year or so, which may or may not lead to a repatriation. So we need to think the bigger picture. The university, I think, is starting to be a bit more proactive at reckoning with its own history. This is a university that was centre to the British colonial project. The professor of anatomy, William Turner, used his colonial networks to allow skulls to come back into Edinburgh. So, you know, the Scots were integral to the British Empire project, I would say. The university was creating more doctors than there were positions for doctors in the UK, so they were going abroad and working abroad. So Edinburgh is indelibly linked to all of these individuals. So I think a lot of it is about funding. It's about a dedicated researcher provenance position as well. Because, you know, there's only 2 of us in the museum. I'm not idle. We get about 350 research requests a year. I host about over 100 research visits in the academic year. So there's a lot going on. We're not hiding anything in terms of what we've got in the collection, but we also need to be more confident in the details, the granular details about who we've got in the collection.
Thank you. I'll come to you first and then go to the back. Yes, please.
Hello, thank you for a very interesting talk. I've got a question really for Malcolm, but a little bit of background first. My husband and I are both medical students in the late 60s, early 70s. And in those days, it was standard to buy a half skeleton. You've got a skull and a half set of bones. Cost about £25. And when you finished your studies, you sold it on to the next generation of students coming in. So there must be an awful lot of anatomical material out there when you think of the number of medical students that have handled these sort of things, because it wasn't until the late 70s that sufficiently good plastic replicas came in to be used instead. So I don't know where all this anatomical material has disappeared to over the years. But interestingly, a colleague of mine died, and much to his horror, when his widow was going through the junk that he left behind, she discovered his half skeleton was still there. What do you do with these?
We had a 1964 alumni visit. They came last year, and 3 of them said the shop across the road, the medical supply company at TVA Place, they bought a full human skeleton, and at the end of their studies, they sold it back to the anatomy department. So we still have like a teaching collection of skeletons of no provenance, possibly from India, we're not sure, of these teaching skeletons, but they just came as skeletons. So what we do with them, we look after them the same as we do as the historic collection. If you find a skeleton at home, we usually just suggest that you phone the local police, and it's usually disposed of. We've got enough without provenance, without taking any from you at the moment. Sorry. They'll just have them disposed of. They'll rule out any criminality. We had there was a phone call from England. I think it was Carlisle, and it was a bookshop, charity bookshop owner, and he found a bit of skin was being used as a bookmark. And so the first thing we said was just make sure it's human and don't take it anywhere near us, and speak to your local police. So.
And I think that's good information to know that people can actually know where to report.
Art
I hope
students
you have
as well.
that on your
Art
website.
students have skeletons, literally in their closets.
Do you have that on the university website?
No, we don't.
Should you?
There's also the nutter element. We don't want to attract too many kind of. I get enough strange emails without encouraging anyone.
Thank you. We'll go to the back now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Lorna Marson. I'm from Edinburgh Medical School, a member of staff there. And I'm really interested, thank you very much for a great talk, fascinating. And one of your last slides spoke about community connections and repatriation. And I suppose what I'm interested in is, in some cases, it's difficult to repatriate. I think, Malcolm, you've kind of outlined some of the challenges and perhaps not always welcomed by some of the communities that you're talking about. But are there other ways that we can acknowledge what has occurred and support those communities in whatever way we can, do you think? I'm not suggesting that your 2 members of staff within the anatomy department take responsibility for that, but do you think as a university there are other ways that we should be acknowledging the part that was played by the university historically, even if repatriation doesn't seem appropriate?
In short, yes. I'm not quite sure how that would play out. One of the issues we're looking at, I think, maybe came out of the race review, is maybe a pot of money where, just to get people to Edinburgh, if they were coming to take back their ancestors, the university does not pay for that. So there's no financial way to allow that to happen at the moment. So I think something like that, if there's a repatriation that's underway to help that, facilitate that would quicken things up a bit. In terms of, I think it's a bigger picture about the history of the university, as well as not just the medical school, and not just renaming buildings. I think there's a bigger thing, a bigger conversation to be had, but I am not going to venture where that is right now. Sorry.
We'll take 2 more questions so that we can keep to time. I would stay in the room for this and then come to you. Anna. Yes. Just hold on for the mic. Middle.
Thank you very much. Thank you for a really informative presentation and for this event. I appreciate all 3 of you. I'm lucky to know 2 of you. My name's Zaki. I'm from the Sudanese community in Edinburgh, one of the African communities here on the doorstep, building towards a claim from the African diaspora and on the continent. My question is a more a reflection in general, which is that 3 words today have not really come up, apart from very recently from Malcolm: crime, justice, and reparation. And I think that while I'm under no illusion that the Anatomical Museum itself can take all of this on its shoulder. In fact, I'm realizing we have allies within the Anatomical Museum. But 3 years as an African diaspora community pushing for work around repair and repatriation. 3 years with 0 funding from the university to then be involved in this so-called race review, which is actually called Decolonized Transformations. That's the name of the project. That's what everyone got involved with. My question is, someone asked earlier, what would it take for the institution to take this seriously? And I wonder, as part of how you would treat contemporary donations of people's body parts and try and treat that equally with those that are historic, if we recognize there has been a crime committed, what do you think from a justice, and particularly reparatory justice, what do you think it will take for justice to be done, either both legally and morally? What do you think that will take beyond what's being demanded right now?
That's a massive question, Zaki. Massive question. I don't know. I don't know if you've got opinions.
I'm the chair.
I think,
And I know Zaki.
I think there's lots of conversations to be had, but I appreciate what you're saying, that I guess the point we need to action all this talk that we've done. And we do have the race review implementation individual, or one of the group who's going to potentially go forward with the race review. So maybe there'll be something that comes out of this. I almost feel it's too big a question for me to answer, to be honest.
And I would add that we had a very interesting conversation before the event started about the complexities that is involved in dealing with all of these issues. And yes, the race review's been done, and we now have the race review response group about the implementation. And one of the key things is to reach out to the communities, work with the communities here, work with the communities abroad, work with the people in Edinburgh and beyond. And yes, we could say that more talk, less action, but it's about how we direct and redirect the talk. And it's about reimagining new ways. And I think I mentioned that to Malcolm. We just have to reimagine new ways of addressing these complicated questions. And yes, 500 years or more of crime, of all of what's happened, is not going to change in a week, and that's terrible. But we have to keep working at it and see where the process leads us, as long as we're committed. I think what will be wrong is if we stop having the conversations. And yes, being put on the spot, you're doing the work, but it's everybody's work. It's all of us working together. And it's about how do we arrive at the place where we would, the principal apologized. So after the apology, what happens? And that's the conversation we're trying to have now. But I do not want to hijack this, and we have to go to that person online. But thank you for your question.
Yeah, I can bring, again, we've got a lot, but I can only pick up one here. This is one that says, with an understanding that repatriation can be slow and difficult, given lack of information, particularly around the skulls you're looking at, what other measures are you taking to treat these remains and the records that you have about them with dignity while they are under your care?
I would say quite a lot. They're not on public display. They're not subject to any sort of research. They're not photographed, not accessed. We have a Care of Ancestors protocol where we're speaking to communities to say how they would like us to treat their remains while they are in our care. So, for example, some communities don't want any association with plastic or man-made materials. Some of them don't want the remains to be handled by female members of staff. Some of them would like a sacred prayer added to the box that they're in. So there's lots of little things that we're doing to try to humanise the individuals in our care. For so long, they've just been seen as these set of Roman numerals. We might not have their names, and we know about their collectors. We don't know about the collect deed. So we're trying to sort of humanise them. And some people say to us, say hello to them, say hello to our ancestors. So we feel a bit strange sometimes, but we go to the store when we're in there and we say hello, good morning, and try it. So there's lots of things we're trying to do. It's a long, slow process.
We have time for one more question. Yes?
Did you still have a question?
Yes. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, thank you. That was very interesting. I went to a talk in which the topic was about medical doctors and the early use of photography, and there was a lot of reluctance in the room by medical doctors to acknowledge that the harm that was caused by this wasn't just secondary. And I also was struck by what you were saying in your discussion, that there's not a lot of research on the medical doctors who are participating in this, and I was wondering if it is because there is a reluctance to look at the harm that they were doing beyond scientific harm, that they were actually engaging in trafficking, in conquest themselves, that they were doing criminal acts. And that's something which I think is still a big open question, is why are we not looking at some of these medical doctors who are taking African bodies as perpetuating in that same criminal injustice against African human bodies deliberately, not for scientific knowledge?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think, so one other aspect of the research, just while you mentioned photography, a lot of the anatomical museum records are in envelopes. Some of them just say photos of skulls. And I think a lot of the photography and documentation of records, again, contributes to this dehumanizing experience. It's very reductionist. There is, in some cases, there was no information attached to any of the photographs. And I think it does contribute to that, distancing. I know that there are discussions, I'm trying to think of the work that I read recently, but there's discussions about how much there is a degree of, separation from medical subjects with medical practitioners and how much this sort of transfers. But I think inevitably with these collections, these historic collections, there are instances where there's being violence perpetuated that is just, I don't think it can't be entirely disconnected. And I think a lot of it is, very traumatic and distressing and was done as a result of colonial violence directly. And maybe some of this, lack of connection was a way to create a distance, which is a very common theme in a lot of these types of discussions and topics. Malcolm, I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
I think you've covered it. You've been seeing the collections up close.
But I think confronted with a lot of the documentation, I think, especially the photographs of skulls, I wasn't able to identify even which of the skulls corresponded in the photographs to the catalogue records. There's a complete disconnect in some of the records, which maybe needs to be further work that's done to sort of more thoroughly catalogue some of the records as well and recognise that these representations of people are present and try and go some way in communicating this information. But it's, some of the research it's quite confronting, opening an envelope that just contains lots of photographs of skulls that are being displayed in a particular way for people to come and look at and, either study or are being displayed. And I think, that should prompt a lot more questions.
On that note, you just want to add your closing remarks?
I didn't prepare any closing remarks, but I absolutely can. So I realised that I gave a very whistle-stop sort of overview of the research that I've been doing with the Anatomical Museum. I'm also aware that a lot of the research I've presented still leaves questions that are unanswered. Again, I would like to really emphasise the difficulty of approaching these kind of collections, this type of work, but also emphasise just why it's so important to be doing this and why it needs to be a sustained effort. I'm one of several researchers that have worked with the Anatomical Museum previously. I certainly won't be the last that is working on these kind of collections, but I think it's this type of research and what I've discussed here really emphasises why there needs to be sustained efforts and funding in place and, time dedicated to this kind of research because it's extremely important and it's underrepresented, underfunded and not prioritised in the way it should be by a lot of institutions.
Thank you. And Malcolm?
Just like to thank Asha actually for her work that she's done. It's been quite incredible. It's the first time. It's not easy looking at this stuff. It's quite traumatic. It's troubling. she's coped with it very well, and what the stuff that she's found will facilitate a much easier repatriation when that happens. And I think it's almost like waving the flag for libraries and archives and archivists and librarians, because we don't use genetic testing, we don't use science to work out who belongs to who. We use the sort of historical evidence in diaries, scribbled away in the margins of notebooks and things like that. So we're in a lot of conversations at the moment with a lot of communities at the University of Edinburgh. There undoubtedly will be many more repatriations in the coming years, probably multiple repatriations a year. The Scottish sector is quite strong, it's quite small, the universities talk to each other, we've all got very similar collections. We can react quicker compared to some of the bigger institutions in London, shall we say, not naming any names. So I think we can, I think the future is looking brighter than it's been for a while. But I appreciate there's so many frustrations. We're not working fast enough, Zaki. I think, don't lose hope, because I think we're heading in the right direction in this sort of stuff. I really do.
That's a brilliant note, to end on a gloomy topic. So thank you. And thank you, everyone, for your engagement, with the talk, your questions and all that. I guess people could still hang around a little while for some conversations. And thank you very much again, Ash and Mark. And finally, before you go, Curious is still going on. I think something is supposed to appear on the slide to show you QR code if you want to register for other events. And that's all of the marketing. Enjoy your evening.